Mediopolis, Chapter 22, The Show Librarian. People are like their books. None are infallible. They all can be mistaken when spoken or read. They can be open books that can be read or written, whether it's easy to read or understand them or not, or really quite a challenge, or even sometimes impossible. There could be open foreign books that are still not understood, without any translation. However open to the foreigner they might be, still they might not comprehend what the words or pictures mean, without first comprehending the language. Even a picture book, since pictures could mean different things to different places. They could show what they refer to. They could have foreign pictures of foreign or alien objects that could be hard to decipher, or perhaps even impossible. The open books aren't necessarily all honest either, of course, nor all relevant. Neither are they all factual. Some, of course, are intended to be fictional stories, presented as fictional stories. They may have some basis in a fact, in the real world. Others tell factual stories, presented as factual stories, that may have some basis in a fictional world, perhaps. Those are just some of the stories, though, and it's complex how many there are. There are the fictional stories that are presented as facts, then they are deceptive in some way. Yet an open book, even if it has some basic facts within it, they could also be presented in a fictional context. The story presented as factual. This type of deception could be intentional also, but there could be good reasons for the deceptions as well. The person may have just learnt it from others, copied the fictional facts into their own book, perhaps not knowing the deception of it, or having perhaps a good reason for it. Then there are the factual stories, presented as fictions, another type of deception, whether accidentally acquired or created by its author with intent. The deceptions of the fictionalized factual world, or the factualized fictional world, can have multiple purposes. They could be done for very good reasons, or even bad reasons, or anything in between. It entirely depends upon why the person is doing it in that way, why they choose to have that deception, even if it's a knowing deception, what the intention behind it is, or was. It can be that others just want to protect other people from a factual world, from a real world that they're too young to understand, or not qualified to understand if it's perhaps irrelevant to. Especially younger children, that's true, or those that could be more sensitive to many different subjects. They could offer them the fictionalized version that's more sympathetic, that's more considered around their abilities and needs, that may be sentimentalized perhaps to cushion the blow of hard truths, of sad truths that may be difficult to accept and people may be unable to deal with at different stages. Many may create fictional worlds to comfort themselves as well as others too. We all can have a tendency to do that, to comfort other people with the hard and difficult and sometimes sad facts that can happen in reality. Fictional ideas can also be a method for studying possible, imaginative, possible worlds, possible speculative future worlds, or even worlds of the past that could have existed, hypothetical worlds. Like what would the world have been like if it was all part of a show and everything was being filmed everywhere, and there were cameras in the jungle, in the oceans, in every house. That could be a kind of speculative, fictional, hypothetical world, rather than necessarily any kind of factual world. That's an imaginative type of world. Trying to imagine, for example, what would a totally transparent society be like, or even an emerging transparent society. Although there's no such thing as that, necessarily, a fully transparent society, we can still imagine, hypothetically, what a possible world could look like, with some factual elements of the world still retained, to give it some plausibility, some reality, to have factual things, but in a hypothetical, imaginative world. We can try and study what our current factual world could look like within a variety of different fictional conditions, under different imaginative circumstances, hypothetical possible futures that could happen, different scenarios that are potential, however likely they are or very unlikely perhaps. If one is loyal to the facts of life and tries to transplant them into a plausible fictional world, okay, taking away people's typical characteristics, their types of temperaments, their various likely abilities according to their different ages, for example, then the implausible fictional world that they are portrayed within can sometimes seem quite authentic then, and a potential future world, if not an actual present one. So open books may have many meanings to many people. Many people can understand them in different ways. Yet it's not so simple with foreign books. Factual fictions and then fictional facts, fictional fictions and factual facts as well. Only the latter are telling the story of the actual real world, the factual facts of the world, or attempting to portray those as well as possible. But then there are others, foreign stories, alien stories, incomprehensible stories, really perhaps some of them more imaginative stories, imaginations of reality. Then the imaginative imaginations. Here are the 4 types of open storytellings: the unknown stories, the really imaginative stories, the imagined reality stories, the imagined imagination stories, and the really real stories. Well, those are the 5 if you include the unknown stories too. Those stories that wouldn't be considered a story because it would be impossible to follow either too much of it or to follow it at all. But of those 5 different types of storytellers, only one is really about the actual real world, or a real attempt to portray the real world itself. That is really a true story, or an attempted true story about reality, about life itself. Although the unknown story could well also possibly be that too, it may just not be possible to know. So not all open books tell a true story, or even a real story, about a real person in a real time, or in a real place, or necessarily even in a real world. It may just be a real person situated in a hypothetical, imaginative, possible world, or talking to an imaginary person, a real person who is talking to an imaginary person, but in reality. So even people that are open books may not always be telling you just about reality alone, but their imaginations of reality, perhaps, or the real imaginations that they have, or even their imaginations about their imaginations. People can be very open about all manner of things, even about fictional characters in real places, or about real people in fictional places, or even about real people in real places, or fictional people in fictional places. Yet being open doesn't mean it's a really real story necessarily then. And even when you do find a really real story, a factually factual story, it's not always then easy to follow along. It's not always suited to one's ability or to one's expertise. It's not of one's subject interest, or is not necessarily one understands or is able to easily follow along. Often you get to read a few pages or chapters of a story and can understand some of it. So people may be open with you about their current chapters, yet be closed perhaps sometimes to their past chapters. Just because they could be fully open to some of the chapters doesn't mean they're open to all of them. They could be closed to some in the present, or closed to some of their chapters within the past, yet closed perhaps on other things. Yet they could even be open about future speculations and closed off in discussing their present situation or their pasts. So even when you do chance to encounter a really real story, a factually factual attempted story that does try to be accurate and relevant in its details and provide as much of an authentic portrayal as possible, then you don't know that it's a fully open story that is always just about the present, or maybe include the past as well as the present and exclude the future, or one that's only open about the present and the future, and that may exclude a historical basis for the actual story itself. Sometimes it's not possible to be open about all of the past and the future chapters of the story, and to situate it only within the actual present. Other times it may not be possible to know what the speculative future might be based on an unknown, uncertain present. But there can be many different reasons for being closed off, either about the present, the future, or the past chapters of a story. And there can be many different combinations of what parts of different chapters could be open or not within the story itself. To find someone really open about all the known story, the past, the present, and the future chapters of it, and in also a really real way, a factual attempt, may seem to happen quite rarely. Yet many people do confide in close ones, and many can be very open in some of their open life as well, sometimes at the right time, at the right place, and when it's actually necessary to be so too, when circumstances dictate and call for that, when it becomes an obligation that one feels driven to. Some open books don't even tell a story indeed. They don't necessarily follow a clear narrative or attempt to tell a story, whether fictional, factual, or whatever other kind, or whatever combination of them. Some may attempt to communicate, yet not be able to necessarily express a coherent story. There could be drunk stories or rambled stories, or there could be demented stories that are partly forgetful of the actual storyline itself and meander. It may be that you can understand some of the information that is given within it, and some of it could indeed be relevant to some extent, but it may lack also a wider narrational structure to it. There may give lists of sentences or paragraphs of the different characters that may seem unrelated at times, that may lack a general overall coherency. Or it's also possible that the person is just not able or chooses not to share fully parts of the story until later, to make it more comprehensible, to reveal things at later time, to include an enigma and a mystery within the story itself, that it could be purposefully done that way, that it could be a drunk character, for example, or a demented character in the early stages, who's trying to tell his story within some of the chapters. There could be many different potential reasons for having a lack of coherency in parts of the story itself, that could be revealed and changed as the story goes on, depending on the structure and the type of characters within it. Some people may be open and honest and relevant about their life, yet they may not present the information necessarily always in a coherent and relevant way that could be understood by others. The reasons can be many, of course, and they can depend on the person's abilities also. Their abilities and also their desires to communicate with others also. So there are the open books of incomprehensible, unknown things, and then the fictional facts, the factual fictions, and the fictional fictions, and then the books of factual facts. Then there are the poetic books, the drunken books, rambled books, and the books that are lists that have stories of different quotations, quotational books, and even musical books, and many others besides, of course. Not all books are understandable, not certainly to all different audiences, nor do they all try to be honest in their ways either. Nor do they all necessarily tell meaningful stories, nor necessarily fully meaningful, however happy or sad they might be in their storytelling. That's how some people can be like books, some open, some closed. Some can be fictional, and often with good reasons, sometimes not. Many people tend to be more factual in their accounts, however, sometimes also with good reason, and sometimes perhaps not. Some can be incomprehensible in their testimonies also as well, sometimes with good reason, and other times perhaps not, through lack of trying to make enough effort. There can be many different occasions when we can all be open and we can all be closed sometimes. Well, we can all give a fictional or a factional account or different versions of the different stories according to the needs of circumstances. A person may be better viewed as a library, in fact, whether it's an open or closed library, or has open and closed parts to their wide, expansive library. with some open books of our stories, with open parts of our lives, and some closed parts that we may still be struggling to understand and decipher about ourselves and our own relations with others and the world, the mysterious social relations with others that we may contend with still and struggle still to understand and to fully express also. Why should we all want to close our books though? Why do we not talk or refuse to open up on some of the issues or on some of the chapters of our lives? But there can be many reasons besides that we don't always fully understand what has happened within our lives and the nature of those things. It may simply be it is something no longer relevant to talk about. As often it's not. We may refuse to open a sensitive book that could be triggering and could be alarming for some audiences, that may just not be necessary for them at their time and place. It may not be appropriate to open up at a particular time and place, nor to a particular person also. It may not be relevant for ourselves either. Something that was an issue dealt with others long ago and is no longer relevant therefore to dwell on such sensitive issues. It could be something that is just so very long and from such a long time ago, it is just no longer relevant. Or something that is incredibly long, long-winded and difficult to explain, far too laborious to get through, and therefore not necessary to go into at length, unless there can be a cohesive version of it, perhaps, to justify the need for doing it. There needs to be a good reason to justify the challenge of opening up on complex sensitive issues that are difficult to coherently summarize. If there's not good relevant reasons to do it to begin with, then it won't be attempted, then there won't be a driving factor to motivate people to do it. It may be that a person simply doesn't know if the book is relevant as well. Sometimes there can be doubts about whether it is actually appropriate, whether it's necessary for others to listen to it, whether they could have any benefit from it or not. There can be serious doubts regarding that. Whether it really is necessary or not for a particular person, or what the particular time is, or when it would be relevant to discuss things. And they may need some meditation, some consideration to be persuaded of the need of actually expressing and opening up on the idea. It can be a big decision sometimes to make, or even on smaller things, just the smaller choice sometimes. Decisions that we'll all make occasionally anyway, but there can be larger choices, bigger dilemmas to face sometimes that we can all face, on whether the information we know could be relevant to others or not, and when and how, and why it should be relevant too. Such a lot on sensitive issues to consider. Or it's also possible that no such contemplations nor discussions could be happening, that there hasn't been a time to really mediate, to discuss and to dwell, to focus and think carefully and cautiously about the issues. We could be unaware of the importance ourselves, or other people could be, of the actual issues, that we could be holding on to useful information, but just don't know that it could be useful to anyone. It could just be something that we simply lack any awareness of its relevancy or how sensitive or necessary that it could be. We just may not know that it could be of any interest to others, just simply from the not knowing, or not knowing others well enough, perhaps, or not knowing their situations, perhaps also. Even when we may know that opening up to a particular person at a particular time and place could well be relevant to them, then we also have to consider the book's sensitivity and be sensitive to the needs of the other persons, to their emotional abilities to understand. So not just something that has to be relevant, but we have to also be concerned for others' emotional capacity, their ability to comprehend and to carry an understanding of the actual information. We may fear of opening up, that it could be something that's too insensitive, that's too triggering or provocative, that could be hurtful to the actual person themselves, something that they might not understand, and something that is not emotionally sensitive and considered enough for them. Something that could be blunt, hurtful, accusatory, and something that could be actually beyond their capacity to deal with it at that particular time and place. If the opening up, for example, is too harsh or judgmental, or overly emotional, or perhaps not even emotionally enough, and not sensitively considered if it is sensitive material, then of course it's understandable that people then would be very cautious about opening up, worrying over the emotional effects of the emotionally provocative material and what cause it might produce in others. If we are going to open up about seriously emotional subjects that could be very serious according to the different people, subjects like death, for example, or long term disease, or even about destruction, or even about grief, or various other issues, separations from loved ones, then even if the information could well be relevant and could well be accurate as much as possible, it must still be sensitively given to the emotional needs of the audience. How we open up to younger children, for example, would be very different than how we would open up to an adolescent audience, to an adult audience, or even to an elderly audience also. We'd need to discover the age, the appropriate needs, and the emotional abilities of the different audiences so that the material is sensitively, appropriately addressed towards the audience and towards their emotional needs and their abilities. So there can be many good reasons to close many books and to close down conversations that could be irrelevant or very insensitive to share at that time and place or with that person. Even when they could be truthful accounts that were given, you don't go into graphic detail about the effects of a complex, difficult disease on a human body to a much younger child who has no need to know of those things at that time and place, perhaps. However true those accounts could well be. And not just that they would be incapable of joining in the discussion and responding and giving advice or learning about it too, but because they would lack the biological and anatomical knowledge, as well as also perhaps the effects of the illness emotionally and socially too. But it's also that it just wouldn't be something that's necessarily relevant for them at that immediate time in their place. And it could immediately even affect them. It could cause them to worry about issues they don't really have to. Younger children cannot understand, nor really comprehend, widespread complex biological and social conditions. They certainly wouldn't and shouldn't be expected to understand complex biological diseases and how they occur and how they progress and what effects that they have on people, physically, emotionally, and socially too. From a societal point of view, one wouldn't expect younger children to have a well-rounded, complex view of that. Never mind a humanistic perspective. They think only about more limited, immediate things that they have in their limited experiences within their life. We have to consider people's own experiences according to their abilities. They may never have spent years visiting hospitals, care homes, home cares, hospices, and others that are sick regularly over many years, so they would not have the care experience necessarily. Nor would they have spent many years being a primary carer for family members also that were living with a disease to understand such an issue. Something that even an adolescent younger audience would perhaps struggle with, although they would have an increasing amount of experience, some of them with that. It would be irrelevant and a waste of time and energy also to discuss something so complex and also quite sensitive, something that would be emotionally too challenging in its issues. We wouldn't want to overload the apple cart, for example, not of our own cart, nor of others too. Not if it would break the cart's wheels, and it could strain more likely if it was overloaded to pull, and it wouldn't then go anywhere anyway, so it would be pointless. If we shouldn't open books for others that are obviously too irrelevant or insensitive, then neither should we want them to be open for ourselves in that way, wanting to be consistent in our views, and not invite others also to open up doors into places that were irrelevant and insensitive to ourselves, as well as others also. Of course, we can't always choose when we open up, always. So we will hear things that could well be irrelevant and insensitive that others say sometimes, things that we don't always choose to hear or listen or watch to. And that can happen also sometimes in different places. Sometimes we do have a choice, though, and more of a choice in how we respond to the irrelevant or insensitive information that we can come across, things that we can meet in different places or at different times. We can choose to fixate on those issues, choose to focus on them, choose to care about them and give time and energy to them. Or we can try and work out whether the information is relevant, to spend more time considering it, to open up more to the person, respond to them, whether to encourage them or not. We can assess and try to discern whether we do think it is relevant and try to respond to them and say whether we do think it's insensitive and why we think it's insensitive or irrelevant to them. We can always try and explain why it's not irrelevant or why it is to the person making the effort to open up if we feel it's wrong the way they're doing it, so that we don't waste more of the time and energy of themselves or others. It's not always easy to know if someone or something is relevant at the time. Sometimes it's not black and white, and there can be many different shades of grey in between, of course, and many discussions to decide that. Discussions that have some relevant information amongst them, amongst the mass of maybe irrelevant data. It could be that some of the information is relevant and others not. Likewise, in a complex conversation, when a long monologue happens, or dialogue or trialogue, it could be that some of the information was quite sensitive, but there were some other areas that were driven and given away in an insensitive way that could have been rude or thoughtless, perhaps. And so it can be a challenge knowing whether the information we give or receive is really relevant and sensitive to the particular audience, because we would need to know that particular audience's own sensitive needs, their emotional needs, as well as their own situation and what would be relevant to their own specific situation too. To know whether they had a need to absorb any of that information, even if some of it might be useful and others not. We would need to really try and weigh up when deciphering whether the information was more irrelevant than irrelevant and whether it was worth listening and trying to absorb and then filter out some of the more irrelevant details to try and discern whether it was worth listening to a longer version of something, just to sort of try and keep out and to take away some of the information that was more relevant, even if a large amount of it may not be. Easy to write that we should open up and honestly and be relevant and in a way that's sensitive to the needs of an audience. Yet living that, each of us, in a life full of complexities, uncertainties, and differing concerns that we all have in different ways, that itself, of course, is a challenge for us all. Perhaps it's the challenge of communication, of expressing ourselves, that we all face. And even people that have worked, lived, and struggled to open up at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way too, will still make many mistakes, as we all will, because we're all encountering new people in new situations, new feelings, and in new worlds even. No one opens up or closes down always at the right time or the right place, and not always with the right people either, and not always at the right time as well. Knowing when to open up and when to close down itself is the challenge to all ages and to all peoples too. Of course, it's possible to open up other books. We do in public books all the time. People willingly give many open thoughts in different formats, whether in books or films, podcasts, in posts, tweets, or various other videos, and in any other material too. Whether they are relevant and honest and sensitively given, that's something to be discerned by wandering, searching audiences themselves. It is to be discerned. We should be cautious about opening up something that's insensitive to our own abilities or irrelevant to our own needs, or something that could be perhaps dishonest and unnecessary, knowing that we could be misled by others as much as by ourselves, misleading others too, even when it may be done through thoughtless passions and the heat of the moment too, through thoughtless, driven in immediate reactions to things. And perhaps it could well be genuine mistakes, even when thoughts have been given over it as well. Quite sensibly, most of us will open up about our own sensitive issues only when alone, or only with those that we feel confident about when in private. We may feel that we are able to talk about some issues that we were too sensitive with in public once we've worked through the feelings on them up to a greater extent, and we know more about how we really feel, and we really feel able to more express it and explain it clearly to others. And then so we can eventually become much more sensitive to ourselves and others that may be affected by such similar issues. And why may we be able to open up gradually if we put the work in and dedication and focus on doing the work to understand more of those issues? Yet even when we may be able to deal with it emotionally more ourselves and have understood it, we may remember in the past that we have struggled too, even if we are no longer struggling with those particular issues. But there could well be many others out there still struggling through some of those issues. So even if you could talk openly about a person's death, for example, or about a particular disease, or about a divorce, or any number of sensitive issues that you'd experienced, that doesn't mean that others that have gone through a similar death, or disease, or divorce would also be able to talk about and understand that in a sensitive way similarly. It doesn't mean that also others could understand it in the same way too, even though they experienced and gone through something very similar to the struggles that you had too. They could be at a different stage of the struggles, as we all are. As we all went through the different stages of those struggles of the grief. It doesn't mean that others are all at the same stage of that grief, because we're all going through different kinds of grief and can be at different stages of the griefs too. We have to assess each person according to the different needs that they have. Yet to all people, because we're all still learning. Okay, you can talk about the death of a pet perhaps, or you might struggle talking about the death of a close friend. You could well talk about the death of a close friend and be comfortable with doing that openly. Yet you might still be wary and find it a struggle talking about the death of a closer family member you are much closer to. Or you could be okay talking about that and comfortable because you'd had some years to adjust and work on it and to understand the issues more. You could be talking about the death of a whole village, perhaps, and be okay with that and have worked through it. Or the majority of people that you'd known throughout your life that had passed on, and reflecting on those things. But you might not be okay talking about the death of a whole world and that everyone that you'd known of being passed on, and that could still be a struggle. People can be at different stages of what their abilities to understand different types and different amounts and different feelings of grief are. The struggle to talk about the deaths of many worlds, whatever stage we could be at, we are all working through different stages in the issues like grief, the shock, the fear, and all the doubts, and all the struggle within it, as well as having many joys and reassurances within the struggle too. Our desires to know more about the uncertainties and the lessons to learn too, the ones that we've already learned and the many more to learn too, at whatever stage or age that we happen to be at. Older ages that are often experiencing many struggles too, as well as the young, but different kinds of struggles. We should all try to be more sensitive to each other's needs and our abilities to understand. Love is love and grief is grief. Whether you're an ancient person, an older person, middle-aged person, a younger person, or at whatever stage, we can all be emotional and be emotionally affected by ourselves and each other. If finding true love is the only real lasting happiness, yet that also comes with true grief also, as well, then it is also that we want true grief for everyone, and not just wishing true love for everyone too, perhaps. The pursuit of happiness seems like a shallow goal in a way, just wanting to be happy all the time. Who could ever live or experience a happy life all the time with the different struggles, with the different hardships that life brings about to all people? It would be wrong to only want a grief for everyone and a life full of grief, a sorrowful story for everyone. You would never want to wish a life full of grief on anyone. But if true love does also mean true grief also, then perhaps it's a grieving kind of love that we all find and that we all learn by. It would be wrong to only want grief for everyone. In the same way, it would be nihilistic to only pursue sadness and sorrow. Yet it's just as wrong also to only want the happiness and joy that love brings, without any of the sorrows, or trying to repress or put away with the sorrows or hide them away somehow. How can we love the world if we don't also grieve for it, feel sad for it? How can we feel for a suffering world if we are not grieving for it? Then there would be no desire to assist the world, understand the world more, support the world, to help the world in whatever way, however small or large, in whatever kind of differing way. We cannot love a person if we don't also care for them and understand, at least to some extent, their sadness. If we don't grieve for them, how can we love for them too? If we feel no sympathy for the world, how can we love the world? We cannot love the world if we don't grieve for the world. We cannot love a person if we don't feel sorrow or feel sad for the person when they are going through sorrow or losses themselves. Never mind loving a person only, because you cannot just only love a person. You mourn and you love a person. You cannot only love the world, you mourn for the world as well as loving the world, and feel a great sense of joy for the world too, as well as struggling to understand and feel a great mystery both in other people and also for the world too. If we don't feel a concern or a compassion first for those that we know, as well as enjoying their company too, and benefiting from each other's company too, then how can we go on to love strangers if we haven't loved and fully grieved for those that we first had a chance to know and care for? We can't love people, refuse to grieve for them, and when that gets too much, just move on to love for the next strangers, until their grief gets too much and we abandon them just to care for the next strangers. If we're always just loving a constant conveyor belt of strangers, then we never truly understand caring and loving and having compassion for others. That loving someone is also mourning for someone, is struggling to get to know someone, is rejoicing in someone's great purpose and in the gifts and virtues they have, as well as trying to forgive all the faults they have too, and as well as struggling with the mysteries and struggling to understand the complexities of a familiar person, of a friend as well. If we don't have and engage in all those struggles with our own friends and families, then how can we go on to understand a stranger ever? Perhaps we cannot love the stranger in any way because we do not know them yet, and we only struggle with those that we are more familiar with, only those that we are able to. Some people sing about crying a river, even though it's only mountains that really cry rivers. If it is a lovely poetic expression in a sense, if not absolutely accurate. In grief, a person may cry a puddle, perhaps, and may grieve for many people that they loved in their lives, if never a world that they could ever understand, nor grieve for, nor fully love either, therefore. But perhaps a small puddle is enough, and perhaps crying for a few dozen people, mourning and loving and struggling and forgiving and confessing and dreaming and working and struggling and playing and dancing and all things with those people. Perhaps it's enough to do that with a few people, a handful of people, or a dozen people, and not a whole world necessarily, therefore. It could be just a little puddle, but that's enough. One doesn't need to cry a stream, a river, or even an ocean, or even a brook. Many puddles of tears could make up a brook in any case, and many brooks make a river, many rivers make the seas, and many seas flow into the oceans, and all things are connected anyway. And our puddles of tears may be small, however tiny or large. We may not cry giant seas or oceans, we may not know whole worlds, but the few peoples and few worlds of those peoples that we do know and love and struggle with, those things are grand and interesting and mystifying and alluring enough. What seems to be isn't always what you think. Inside a closed book could be anything: a weapon that could harm others, a medicine that could assist and cure others. It could be a recipe for disaster, or a recipe of how to find true love. It could be an encouragement to you to think more about important issues, or even a warning to think less and just care less about issues, to not be affected so much, or an encouragement to be more sensitive and considerate, or a plea to stop being so concerned about others all the time. Closed books, therefore, have a great appeal and a mystery to us, an alluringness. Yet there is also a fear about unknown closed books that are never opened. There is the desire to know what the information hidden within the book is, or within the person, or within the world itself, and equally a fear of discovering something that could harm ourselves or others, as much as something that could greatly assist ourselves or others too. A closed book or a closed person is simply not known, a mystery. So it is really the fear of the unknown information, and also equally the desire to find out the unknown too. The desire for it to benefit us potentially, and the fear that it could harm us all too. We cannot always tell from the appearance outside, not of a book nor a person, what's really lurking, hidden within inside. What the story is within, unknown. We can't always know from appearances, not from the outside. Sometimes the cover of the book, the appearance of the person, can be a fairly reasonable, reliable guide to what's inside, but other times may not be at all. We may guess from the picture, from the name of the book, or from its size, from the type of font, from the wording, what genre it is, from the style of it, and what the subject matter may be. Just like a person, we may guess what that person has. We may think they have a happy story because they simply appeared as happy, or a sad story because they just happen to appear as sad to us, depending on how they seemed, how they appeared to be. Yet we all know the old proverb too well, not judging a book by its cover, nor people by appearances. Because too often we can all be very mistaken in our judgments, in our discernments, and mistaken by the outward appearances that can be so right but so wrong some of the times. Our appearances and our judgments of a book or a person, a house or a country, of any number of things, of a company of people, of a garden, or of any number of things that could be hiding deeper secrets hidden within it. Perhaps a person could well be just plain dull looking. It could be a discreet book that may actually have some fascinating information or stories within it. And a sensational cover on the outside could actually disguise a very ordinary, mundane type of story that is relatively unordinary. A person may appear as happy to the world with fake smiles and be very professional at acting and appearing happy to others, or make themselves appear that way, yet they could be carrying a heavy burden, an untold, sadder story within, that they would choose not to advertise perhaps to the world. An ordinary looking average person could have a wild, outlandish, incredible tale, unbelievable. Or it might call itself just a story, yet have more of a poetic feel to it than it really showed or said it was. Or it may be that it appeared as just something that was animal, but actually inside it was very historical. Or it might appear that it's a history teacher to you, but when it opens up, it's more an imaginative kind of history, or a poetical kind of history. What seems to be isn't always what you first think it is. Sometimes we have to get to know a book or a person much more, to probe much deeper, to explore it much more. How does it relate to the other things around it, to its author? Where did it come from? How, why, when, and where did it get there? We have to look at the context, the wider context of the book, the situation, or the person itself, to explore around it, to see where it is, when it is, how it is, and why, if we can find out that, why it is placed there and at that time and place. We need to get to know a lot more about it before really fully knowing to make a truer judgment of discerning. Turning perhaps and looking at the contents page could be useful, although we may not know what it's trying to guide us through. We may not even know if there is a contents page, what it actually means, and what those particular foreign terms or yet unknown terms may be referring to. It may not even have a contents page, of course. There are often short summaries, brief introductions that people can give to explain the purpose of what they're about, of why they're there, of how they're going to process, and of what kind of material they'll be focusing on. Although not all have an accurate guide to this, some just begin without any introduction at all, as they are, and they never really explain why they are going to explain the things, or what they will be focusing on, or when or how. So introductions and contents should be given and explored where possible, but are not always given fully, not by all books nor people. Why they are exploring the subjects that they are and how, as well as who and what it is actually going to be about, sometimes is left out altogether, but sometimes only given in part. If there's no introductory guide or no brief introduction or explanation for the purpose, however genuine or mistaken it could be, then there's no way then of knowing fully what that closed book could be, what its worth could be, or what its risk, beyond the brief explanations of the black page, and also the appearances that it seemed to give, and the context that it was situated within. You cannot always judge the book from its cover, nor its place, nor its introduction either. Many books and people can be without proper explanations or appearances, and can still be relevant and useful and interesting, depending on the situation. You might think, for example, that a book says it will be searching for the truth, and that the truth is important to it. And it may well be that. Yet when you open it up to find it's actually a search for truth about a rare, possibly extinct animal that you've never heard of and are not really that interested in, and has no real relevance anyway because it was from so long ago, however truthfully it may be, and it's a very long search for it, or even if it had stated that in the introduction, you may have felt at the end of the search that you knew all the information before, as you'd read many books about that similar, you knew about the rare, extinct possible animal, and so it was irrelevant to reread what you already knew again. So a contents page telling more specific information of the type of the true search it was, and of the specific type of evidence provided, so that you can know what the type of search specifically it is, so what they'll be searching for. That will allow others to make a much more accurate, informed choice. So requesting and reading a brief guide to what's within is very useful in deciding how, where, when, what, and why you decide to read and absorb more. What people read and absorb is important, as how we read people and where and when we do. It is very important in getting to know them and to learn the things that they carry from them. Why others choose to read us as well as we them is also important too. Why we read and are read by others, and why we all read each other, are important things to consider. For taking the time and making the effort to do so, there should be a good reason, or at least a perceived good reason, to make a lot of effort to try and educate and learn things from each other, if it could be relevant, or even sometimes just for fun, to entertain each other a little too, to be comforted by each other, to be consoled or counselled by each other too, or even just out of a little curiosity about each other, because we may have concerns about each other and may wonder about each other too. That we may read mysterious people sometimes, or may sometimes read comforting people too, or counselling people, or challenging people too, where we may challenge each other also. There can be many different good reasons for reading each other, and also listening to each other also. We should only read and listen others if we really need to, or if we think that we need to, because sometimes we're not always sure. We should only read others and listen to others if it really truly is needed or something we think is. Yet do we always know what we need? Sometimes we can know, and sometimes, of course, we don't. Sometimes we have learnt the things that we need to learn, yet it is also the case that sometimes we don't always know the things that we still yet have to learn, actually, along the way. Sometimes not until we find out the things do we actually know, yes, that's it, that I needed to learn that.